Hello everyone, welcome to the second part of the Argossean city tutorial. I am very sorry for the delay, but as I mentioned earlier here and on Twitter, my disk died and I've lost both the save containing complete city and all the raw unpublished footage. I've still got a lot to rebuild, but I can already share with you another part of the city, the acropolis. Literally meaning high city, acropolis were fortified citadels of Greek cities, placed on an already quite defensible natural landmarks. I have a rather nice spare here, but first I need to connect it to the city. It is by no means perfect, as it has one side completely open, but finding a location for a project like this requires compromise. And to be honest, I don't really care about that side anyway. What's important for me is the cliff behind the theater, rising sharply above the city and serving as a monumental base for the Grand Temple and other buildings of the Acropolis. I'm not even going to try to hide the connection. In fact, I'm doing the opposite. The stairs should be massive, to give an illusion that it's not entirely man-made structure, but rather a part of the cliff that's been turned into a ramp. To enhance this effect and make it a little less boring, I've built a line of sloping walls running along the outer edge to create a size gradient, huge natural rocks of the cliff, then quite massive stones of the foundations, and finally regular bricks right below the stairs. Finally, I've built ramps on the sides in a similar fashion to make the whole structure feel stable and massive. I'm using the same approach here as I did earlier for the city. The plateau needs a centerpiece, a large PERIPTERAL temple. Then I'm going to further define it with X and Y axes and borders. Some people have fantastic imagination, and they can look at a patch of empty space and immediately see where all the various buildings would fit well. I can't, so I need help and guidance. That's why I'm starting with the framework, while the large temple will dictate the height of the remaining structures. The Grand Temple will be basically a scaled up version of the one I've built in part 1, with some minor changes. First, the Crepidomo. The base upon which the temple is built will be different. I want a large open space around the temple, as this is one of the most important meeting and gathering areas of the city. So instead of elevating the building, I'm going to make a rather large and flat base that seamlessly integrates into the pavement around it. To achieve this, I'm using the fence trick to create 3 shallow steps. Going up using fence is too much, so I'm following it with fence foundation to halve the distance, which also makes it possible to simply walk from one step to the next without jumping. I'm using argossean tiles for this, since Crepidoma is an integral part of the temple. Inspired by the Parthenon standing on the Acropolis of Athens, I've decided to make it an octa-style PERIPTERAL, which simply means that there are 8 columns on the front, and the whole building is encircled by a single row of columns as well. This gives me plenty of space inside to decorate later, but also introduces one major issue. The roof becomes quite wide. To be historically accurate, the building would need a simple gabled roof, but it's impossible to build in-game without distorting the proportions of the design, as the roof tiles have improper angle. Well, to be honest, nothing is really accurate in this building, as there are way too many straight lines and right angles. The thing with post and lintel buildings is that if built perfectly, they create unpleasant optical illusions, especially the apparent sagging in the middle. Size of the building significantly magnifies this effect, but ancient Greeks were aware of that and devised a number of clever ways to fix the issue. For starters, the Crepidoma is not exactly flat, but rather is a very gentle dome. The long straight lines of the entablature are actually curved slightly, and the columns, instead of being straight, have a larger diameter in the middle, the entasis, and they are not at the right angle, but lean slightly towards the building. These are just a few examples of Greek ingenuity, which allowed them to create monuments like Parthenon, but the greatest testament to their skill is the fact that it is imperceptible. Parthenon simply looks perfect. I considered my options and opted to divide the roof into 5 sections. The middle is slightly taller than the rest. The most important factor was point of view. In most cases the building will be seen from below, and the longer side is visible from most of the city, so the proportion of crepidoma, columns and roof has taken the priority. Front also looks more or less acceptable with the 5 gables. But yeah, it is a travesty. Finally, I've added fences, as they have the alternating pattern of triglyphs and metopes, which are mandatory for this style. First defining feature of the acropolis is in place, so now I need to organize the remaining space. I started by extending the pavement right next to the stairs, in a straight line across the whole plateau. This will help me to avoid problems later on, as the wedge foundations can be quite disruptive. Next step is to encircle the whole area with walls. For some of you this might seem strange, as walls in a project like this are usually just an afterthought, a finishing touch only applied when all the important structures are in place, and sure, it makes a lot of sense to spend time and effort on major landmarks inside the city first, but this requires careful planning. Most people, me included, usually have an idea, a postcard-like snapshot of the thing they want to build, but sometimes they lack necessary skills to turn this vision into a usable set of blueprints. It is easy to imagine a monumental castle or temple perched on a rock above the sea of rooftops, but building it requires filling all the blanks, and that's an intimidating task. That's why I'm following a different route in this tutorial. Organizing and dividing available space breaks up the task at hand into a series of small steps. It's like the difference between painting on a blank canvas and filling up a coloring book. The wall itself I've kept simple and heavy, but relatively low, so that the buildings of Acropolis aren't completely obscured. Above the theater I've decided to completely remove it, mostly for aesthetic reasons. Still, even the little fence retains some defensive function, as there's a rather tall cliff right below it. Also, I wanted to indicate a passage of time. Once fortified heart of the town, the Acropolis opened up on one side, as the growing city below made that whole section redundant. With the framework in place, I can now easily fit the remaining buildings. Space between the Grand Temple and the theater will be perfect for an altar. Since most of the area will be paved over later, small height variations are crucial as they break up and obscure the monotony of large flat surface, hence the fence trick again. Actually, I'm going to use it in some way in all the buildings of the Acropolis. This building, even though quite simple, actually requires 2 mods to be completed. Less building placement restrictions and glass constructions and more. First one greatly enhances your options when it comes to stacking various tiles, in this case foundations and fences. The second contains a lot of new building pieces, but I love it for a different reason. The pillar snap point extension. This item snaps to foundation and adds multiple new snap points for pillars. This might look a bit confusing, but I've just placed them. The thing is, they are practically invisible as their mesh is hidden inside the foundation. Since the foundations are at different levels, I had to snap pillars below to fill the gap. This usually requires some wiggling as the outline snaps correctly when camera's at a somewhat awkward angle. Even though the altar is freestanding and open, I want to create a symbolic barrier between the sacred and profane space. To this end, I elevated it above the ground and built a very soft barrier on top. A column that takes the form of a woman is called caryatid. Their origins are uncertain. According to Vitruvius, the village Cariae allied with Persians, and later, upon their defeat, Cariae women were sold into slavery and forced to do hard labor. Another version is that in Cariae during festivals of Artemis, young maidens danced carrying baskets of reed on their heads. Personally, I wouldn't trust Vitruvius here, as he was a Roman author from 1st century BCE, and caryatids were already present in Greek architecture before Persian wars. One source of confusion and possible link between human-shaped columns and slavery or penance were their male equivalents, named after the Titan Atlas. He fought against the Olympic gods, but unlike most of the Titans who were cast into Tartarus, he was sentenced to stand on the western edge of the world and forever hold the sky on his shoulders. Unlike caryatids, Atlantes are usually portrayed as suffering, their backs arched under the heavy burden, their arms lifted to support the weight of entablature. Earlier on, I mentioned passage of time. This is a crucial idea to consider when designing a city, as it's one of the key factors contributing to its realism. Also, it's quite hard to achieve, as it requires delicate balance between homogenization and change, well-designed plans, and awkward execution. To indicate the city's history, a variation in style of buildings that perform similar functions may be introduced. Also, complexity of commonly placed elements should vary. The hard part is doing it in an aesthetically pleasing manner. Here I've decided to build another temple, but unlike the previous one, this is pseudo-peripteros, a design prominent in Hellenistic period. The difference between the two boils down to engaged columns or pilasters replacing freestanding ones on the sides, hence the addition of pseudo to the term, which literally means lie or fake. Another thing I've changed are the walls. I decided to flip them so that the colorful inner side faces out. There is a widespread misconception about the looks of ancient Greece and Rome. The white marble antiquity is a lie. A very persistent one. Solidified by decades of mass culture integration, it is still hard for some people to accept that it never existed. Today, careful examination allows us to reconstruct the way statues and reliefs looked, thanks to remains of pigments still attached to their surface. Also regarding statues, marble was more of a Roman thing. Greeks preferred casting them in bronze, though more often than not original items were lost, and only Roman copies remained. Both would be painted over anyway, so the one clear difference would be the addition of structural elements, columns, etc., supporting outstretched arms and other elements at risk of fracture in marble versions. Apparently, Funcom didn't get the memo. I'm joking, of course. This was a conscious decision, as they seem to be more interested in adding anachronistic mass culture clichés, rather than staying true to the lore. Why else would they add, for example, 16th century Japan to a game set between 30,000 and 10,000 BCE? Rule of cool. Gone wrong, as usual. Ubisoft at least tried in AC Odyssey. I mean, they got almost everything wrong, but polychromy was nice touch, and that one scene showing various stages of building a column. Even though I want my acropolis to feel more like a government and religion center, I'm trying to make its history as a fortress somewhat apparent. One extremely important factor for surviving a siege is availability of water. It may seem out of place due to the location, but there is a precedent. Acropolis of Athens actually had a freshwater spring in a cave located on the side of the hill. It was well developed, fortified and connected to the propylaea, the gates of Acropolis. The structure collapsed sometime in antiquity though, and the Romans decided not to rebuild it. Instead, they made a vertical shaft to allow access to the water directly from the Acropolis. The remains of Clepsydra, as it was called, were forgotten until the late 19th century when they were rediscovered by archaeologists. Next building, called BOULEUTERION, houses the council. This type of structures, or rather the ruins, were found in many Greek cities. The typical BOULEUTERION consists of walled courtyard surrounded by a colonnade and large chamber where the assembly would gather. Seats were placed along 3 walls of the chamber at first, but later they were replaced by stone steps, not unlike the amphitheater. Most of you are probably familiar with this design, as it's still used in many countries for parliament buildings. I've chosen to build the stone steps, which look better in my opinion, but they may introduce some issues. I've also added some height variation to the courtyard, to make the place more interesting and break up the monotony of this almost completely flat plateau. One extremely important element of these constructions are the fence foundation. Due to the way I've chosen to build the stone steps, the walls would end up at different levels, so I've encircled the main building with fence foundations and made sure to snap walls to them instead of the squares. Another issue that's directly related to the way foundations are placed is the gap between the columns and the roof. I filled it using ceiling tiles and some fences. Finally, to hide all this, I've decided to double roof the whole building so that it looks fine both from outside and inside. The exact nature and competence of the council varied depending on the time and place, as the Greek poleis had a variety of government types, ranging from tyranny, oligarchy and monarchy to democracy. A word of warning though, all of these words are still in use today, more than 2,500 years later. In that span of time their meaning shifted slightly. For example, tyranny has overwhelmingly negative connotations now. It was not the case back then. For example, the Athenian tyrant Pisistratus was a benevolent ruler and patron of arts. The term tyrant did not imply malice, rather illegitimacy, as tyrant's right to rule came from power he accumulated instead of law or tradition. Anyway, Pisistratus' rule gave Athens more than 2 decades of peace and prosperity. He died of natural causes and was succeeded by his son Hippias. The same is true for democracy. In the context of classical Athens, it should not be understood in the same way as today. Consider for a moment the cornerstones of modern democracy. People as sovereign ruler, their will enacted by government chosen by popular vote, rule of law, and equality of all citizens. At first glance, nothing seems to be wrong. In classical Athens, adult citizens took part in assembly, ecclesia, where decisions regarding state were taken by majority vote. The issues begin to emerge when definition of citizen is examined. As it was, only men over 20 who completed military training, ephebeia, were granted this privilege. Citizenship was hereditary, but after 450 BCE, only if both parents were Athenians. This excluded most of the population from taking part in the government. Women, slaves and foreigners, called metics, were all left out. The last group requires further explanation. Metics were migrants, mostly from other Greek city-states, and freed slaves. But the condition was hereditary, so their descendants, even if born in Attica, could never claim citizenship. Of course, this still leaves thousands of people able to vote, and they definitely wouldn't fit in this little building. Boule was something different. In case of classical Athens, after reference of Cleisthenes, Attica was divided into 10 phylae or tribes, and each sent 50 representatives to form the council. To qualify for this position, citizen must have been at least 30 years old and belong to Zeugitai or higher class. The classes of Athenian citizens were defined by Solon's Code of Laws in 6th century BCE. The deciding factor was income. The main difference between ecclesia, the assembly of all citizens, and boule was that the former was a legislative body, while the latter performed administrative functions. After all, it's impossible to have state's daily affairs run by an assembly numbering in thousands. So in this way, boule was closer to modern civil service and the executive branch of the government, especially when granted special powers during crises by the ecclesia. Though it also had influence on legislation, as it decided the agenda for the ecclesia. That is not to say that the council proposed new laws. This was a privilege of every citizen. But before a new law would be voted on, the council had to produce a probulemata, a formal preliminary motion that was presented to the assembly. Should the vote pass, legislators called nomothetai would be chosen to further examine and vote on the proposed changes. Laws passed in this manner were called nomoi, and the rule was absolute. Both the assembly and council could also issue a decree, psephisma, but those could never contradict the laws, nomoi. Anyway, I'm getting off track. Basically what I wanted to say is whenever you're reading a text that's a couple thousand years old and something seems familiar, take it with a grain of salt and examine it carefully. And if you're really interested in classical Athens politics, I'd recommend reading Plutarch's Life of Solon, or even the whole Parallel Lives. Aristotle's Politics, and works of Demosthenes. The last one unfortunately is available for free only on Perseus Digital Library, so you'll need to either learn Attic Greek or fork a few bucks out for the translation. Oh, and don't go too hard on Aristotle. Different times, different world, guys. Don't let his apparent views on women and slavery taint your perception of all his works. Also, I do not approve of slavery and misogyny in any way, shape or form. I believe in knowledge and seeking truth. A book is worth reading even if the author's views are unacceptable, as understanding what we were as humans allows us to appreciate how much we achieved and how much we still need to do. Truth, even horrible, leads to understanding and enlightenment, while ignorance of history is the first step on the way to repeating its most horrifying mistakes. Right, let's get back to building. There's a little bit of space left between the fountain and the BOULEUTERION. I've decided to keep it open as a place for people to gather and added a decorative colonnade similar to the one around the theater. It looks a bit misplaced, as if forced into this location, and that's exactly my goal. I wanted a certain degree of awkwardness here to again indicate passage of time. As different politicians tried to leave their mark, various public works would be carried out, and even though they might be beautifully designed, they might clash with what's already there. The drawback of the method I've chosen for designing Acropolis and the whole city is that the more buildings are placed, the more limited I am in their design, as the remaining free area gets more and more constrained. So, for this building, the Prytaneion, I had to come up with my own design. Actually, history gives me a lot of freedom here, as there was no single widely used plan for this structure. Its form could vary, as its function didn't depend on any physical feature of the building. So, why was it important? Prytaneion was a symbolic home of the whole nation. Inside, an altar to Hestia, goddess of home and hearth, was placed where eternal fire burned. One aspect of monarchs that's often forgotten was their role as a link between the mortals and the divine, and so it was king's duty to maintain the eternal flame. When monarchy was abolished, this link was maintained by specially appointed officials. In Athens, there were archons, among them Archon Basileus, literally meaning king, who performed the religious duties of the monarch. This idea was so strong that it survived even after reforms of Cleisthenes, when Prytanes became the highest executive power and archons lost their influence. Also, it's generally a good idea to keep Eternal Flame going, unless you want another Oblivion crisis. Prytaneion was not a temple though. It was profane in nature and should be considered a seat of the executive branch of government, in most cases something like town hall. As for the Prytaneis, they varied in number depending on polis in question. Remember the representatives of the 10 tribes in Cleisthenes' Bulle? They would take turns and become Prytaneis for 1/10 of the year, so there was 50 at any given time. And now the Acropolis is complete and ready for a detail pass. Thank you for your patience. Hopefully the new disk will work well, but I learned my lesson and now all important data has backups. Thank you for watching. Cheers!